in tragedy, I've often found that most tragedies are mislabeled tragedies because the characters within them are usually so lacking in grandiosity that the tragedy seems kind of frivolous.
And
It's just it's just a stupid bastard like Hamlet or something that gets himself that
yeah,
suicides.
they're not really tragedies. Tragedy isn't a terrible thing that happens. It is a terrible thing, but a tragedy also involves the element of a great person. Watergate was a tragedy when the president of the United States, because of his own insecurities, ends up screwing himself. And there's some great humor with a couple of Richard Nixon scenes here too in this book. When Richard Nixon is going to the movies with his wife, there's a funny scene, and he appears once or twice after that too. But anyway,
Richard Nixon seems to be a great comic foil, somewhat in your whole universe.
well, yeah, Richard Nixon and Frank Sinatra were two villains of my dad's life. There were the two people my dad hated the most were Sinatra and Nixon, and one of the reasons I actually have Paulie Maravelli have the scene where he beats the shit out of Frank Sinatra with brass knuckles. That's sort of an homage. That's a bone to my dad. My dad would love to have read that scene because Paulie's about 20 years older than Frank Sinatra, and when Sinatra first became a big time singer in the late 30s, he wouldn't play Paulie's club or something. So Paulie beats the shit out of him. And like you said, there's also Jake LaMotta, and we have a few scenes where we see Jake LaMotta as a drunken stumble bum.
I wanted to mention something you alluded to earlier, and that's Mad Men. And you mentioned the character. What was his name again?
Roger Sterling, and I made him Roger
Sterling.
Silva.
Yes. That's interesting. I've watched all of Mad Men. I know that you reviewed the first 4 or 5 seasons. And one thing I noted particularly with that character is how diluted it gets and how he just becomes, just a comic character for the most part. Whereas in the earlier seasons, at least there was a little bit of characterization. But later on, he's just quipping endlessly, and there's no characterization or narrative to his tale. He's a good example too, though, of why that character is successful in that work, as opposed to Don Draper, who is kind of grows more and more one-dimensional as the show goes on. Is at least he has a sense of humor. At least there's that entertaining element, whereas Don Draper's just goes into melodrama, and it helps too that John, what's his name, John Slattery.
Yeah, John Slattery. I think
he's a better actor than the Don Draper portrayer.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Norwegian could be expanded probably into a decade worth of seasons, and it would never lose focus on all the individual threads and characters. Whereas something like Mad Men, which is so highly praised, it just gets worse and worse and worse.
You couldn't make a movie out of this book, A Norwegian in the Family. It would have to be you probably say 8 years because it takes place over 8 years. You'd have to have each year is basically a season. And there's enough stories and enough hints of stories that you could write little things about, say, Virgil Walker. You could make an episode just around what really was about him too. So here, anyone who wants to do the greatest cable show, this is it. A Norwegian in the Family would be, because you would have all these great celebrities too. And that's another thing with this, which is why it works. You can, there's the scene where Woody Allen and some of the Dorothy Kilgallen and a couple of other celebrities are in Paulie's restaurant and whatnot, and there's just so much in it. But go talk about. Do you have any questions specifically on some of the chapters or some of the scenes or characters here?
Well, I was just going to get to one. Okay. Ass Rape Delicious Boy,
yeah.
Which
is that in book 1 here?
Very humorous. That's on page 310.
Okay.
And it's summer 1961. What is great about this one is besides the humorous aspects, you see the whole development of this character, the titular character, but you also see how Paulie, well, initially uncomfortable with him. He never changes. He refuses to change his opinion of him, even though he's likely wrong in what he's thinking. And as soon as Ass Rape delicious boy goes against him and tells him to go fuck off, you see how all those years of resentment Polly has for him comes off in his murder.
Yeah. Well, it should be said you were talking about starting. This is one of the great intros to a chapter. It's talking about the Scotchman. You know, he was a
Yes.
hell of a hard drinking Scotchman. Name of McTavish or McSomething. It didn't matter. He was one of those fucks with reddish hair who always preceded an exclamation with an "ach," as if hocking up a piece of a lung. If your name was Danny, he'd call you Donnie. And goddamn it all, this motherfucker had shit to say. And so we get a couple of pages of the description of this character, and then we find out it's Paulie just watching him. So
it reminds me, just the cadence of it kind of reminds me of Goodfellas on Speed.
Yeah.
It's just, the declamatory nature of some of the chapters, and just the anecdotal stuff.
And then we get Toots Shore, and this is where we get Jake LaMotta coming in. And so this is at Toots Shore's restaurant that he's watching it. Gleason, we get the LaMotta Paulie feud here, and then we run through all of that. And so you get through thousands of words, probably about 7,000 words before we then get back to this ass rape delicious boy story. So that's.
Do you think titling it that is showing though that even though you're getting this aside, it's still imperative to the characterization of this particular thing, or that it leads into this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great title because people are going to look title ass rape delicious boy. What the fuck is that? So people are going to be waiting for that. And this is apparently when Big Frank was jailed for 60 or 90 days, and he met this young kid. And when the kid gets out, Frank wants to give him a job and whatnot.
If we're talking about humanity too, his interactions with him and the fact that he likes him so much for whatever reason shows a little bit of softness in Frank too.
Well, Big Frank in the first half of the book seems like he's going to be the hero of the book. But if you hadn't read the Vincetti Brothers came first. Big Frank. I say that in the Vincetti Brothers, the Norwegian and Big Frank are the two super criminals of the book. They're sort of the twin towers of evil of that book. So that Big Frank is an evil bastard. And in that book, we also find out that Big Frank and the Norwegian are the ones that did in Paulie. So we know that's inevitably coming if we've read that. If we haven't read that though, Big Frank looks like he's going to be the guy who's going to rebel and be the good mobster and whatnot. But we find out that he's the spiritual son of Paulie in every way. And at a certain level, even though he totally betrays Paulie and has Paulie killed, has Paulie's wife killed, has Paulie's mistress and son killed at the end of the book, at a certain level, you have to think that Paulie would have been proud of Big Frank for doing it.
It states that at the end too, about how Paulie would have understood.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things and one of the things that's interesting is in my Weston book, the young girl that's rescued in that Weston book. In this book, we find out that she is the midwife who brings Paulie into the world. Paulie kills her in 1930, and the murder of that woman in 1930 also ends up in the Weston book as to end that book. And so again, Paulie is everything that Paulie does seems to be connected to everything else in the fictive universe. And Paulie is like Jupiter or the sun. Everything revolves in this universe around Paulie in one way or the other. We may look off into the Jupiter that is Big Frank, but still Big Frank revolves around Paulie.
And it also, we were talking about repurposing other scenes earlier. It uses a scene from Woody Allen's Radio Days, which is a comic film, and it repurposes for the murder of Ass Rape Delicious Boy. The song, too, is played earlier on, so it has kind of a haunting quality to it. And the lyrics are well chosen for how you contrast that.
Yeah.
Did you? I'm assuming that you consciously mimicked that scene in Radio Days, however.
No, actually not. I chose that because there was a TV show called Sanford and Son in the U.S. in the 1970s, and the lead character, played by Red Fox, always used to sing that song whenever he was being sarcastic. If I didn't care. And so But it's interesting that you relate that to the Woody Allen film, and that if that works, that's fine. But I actually, the reason I chose it was because of the sitcom Sanford and Son.
That's very odd because it plays out in a murder scene too in Radio Days. That's where you get that
Yeah,
that
well,
monster
it's
brings
one
him
of
up to
those
his
things
mouth.
that may have been in my unconscious. It wasn't consciously planned that way. I was consciously thinking of Sanford and Son.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Um, okay, let's go on to a different chapter too. We should see here. The faggot Red Sox. Yes, this is another great intro too
Which
about how
what page?
that's the following chapter
Oh,
340.
and it should be said too, the two scenes where Paulie kills the people, Ass Rape Delicious Boy's murder occurs first, but it's actually the second killing because it takes place a few years later. The second killing that we see actually occurs, and it's the guy who preceded Ass Rape Delicious Boy. So Paulie kills these two people back to back, these two helpers, but we only find out about the first helper later on and looking back. So again, I'm playing a lot with time, but yeah, the faggot Red Sox, New York City.
I was going to get into this, but I want to ask you a question pertaining to what you just said now. Big Frank, since you see him in Machete Brothers, you know what kind of turn he took on Polly. Do you think that reading them together, you'll naturally assume something will happen? Because even though I knew what would happen, that Polly would eventually be dead, the plot does not really matter to this with all the different asides and
Yeah,
narrative tropes that go onto it.
I could tell you the 20 major plot points and how they resolve in this book. It would still not prepare you for the experience of the book. The book isn't plot isn't A to B to C. Plot is the unveiling of character, the how. You know, by all means, if you were to ever write, say, a 10 or 20,000 word review of this book, I would have no objection to you telling how it ends and the techniques I use and whatnot, because that's still not going to prepare you for the immersion, the total immersion within the scenes, within the dialogue, within the characterization. Plot is character. Plot is not what happens. Plot is character. And that's why most fiction of the last 40 or 50 years is terrible. Even the best of it only, it's rare. A few books by William Kennedy or Charles Johnson, maybe a couple of other people here or there that have been published, can make claims to greatness. But most of it is horrible. It's horrible
And they're
because of that.
antithetical to the A to B C narrative, at least in their best works.
Mm.
So we'll go. This is another appearance of Elaine Shore. Let
This,
me go through. Let me ask you another question while I pour through these things. The metaphysical nature of the book means that you're allowed to be very flexible with how it goes. Now, in the Faggot Red Sox, it seems like every chapter. I mean, if you go through this, it transitions from one narrative to the next after that. Is and some of the chopped up bits with Elaine Shore. I am assuming that that is all in service to showing the difference between the Norwegian and the family, and that Manny's unconscious, and rather than a Norwegian in the family.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, pretty much.
And do you think that because I've noted in one of your short stories, I think I have it somewhere here, but I can recall it easily. In This Human Animal, there are scenes where characters will break out into the fourth wall, or characters will suddenly interrupt other characters, and it will seem kind of jarring at first, just as these little asides do when you first experience them. But then it will showcase that it really wasn't someone breaking into the fourth wall, and that it was this character imagining someone doing that due to the loneliness that afflicts the said character.
Mm.
These little asides too don't just fit in with the metaphysics, but also with some of the ambiguities of what will go on with these characters later in their life. And I think that it shows a deeper aspect of each and every individual thread when these things kind of just drop off.
Mm. I'm just noticing in this chapter too. This is we talked about the Luft repetition. it should be stated. I think this chapter has the first uh, aside on a possible person who could be the mule. I have a character called Mark Callis, which is the real name of the professional wrestler called the Undertaker. I like the name Mark Callis, and we find out he has a brother named Gene Callis, and it could be that Gene Callis is the Undertaker. So there are about anywhere from maybe 8 to 10, 12 people that are posited as possibly the mule. And I think this is the chapter that has the first uh, asides on someone who could be the mule. And we find out a little bit about this person. Then we get the editor's note here. It should be noted at this point in the narrative, and then it ends up just Elaine Shaw talking again and flapping her gums.
And about how they all the time about how they repurposed and added extra things. Is that maybe an aside too about how editors will kind of take over most books and destroy them in some way?
Well, a lot of the stuff that she says is obvious.
Yes.
You get the sense that the editor, she's kind of dense, and she's trying to take people by the hand and weave them through the narrative. And a lot of what she says is obvious. There's a similar element in my kids' book where a couple of people who read it thought that when I had Kabi Caputo saying some really dumb things, that I was having Kabi say these dumb things to guide the people along for obvious things. No, the reason Kabi says them is because he's a stupid fuck. The reason that he says these obvious things is to show that he's a dumb ass and doesn't get things. Not that the reader doesn't get things, but that Kabi doesn't get things. In the same way, Elaine Shaw is doing some of the things. I mean, of the maybe 25 or 30 points that she makes in the book, 5 or 6 of them are interesting and worth reading. Most of the rest of them are just her trying to fill in gaps in the manuscript.
Yeah, so even the editor has a character to her.
Yeah.
And whereas Maddie Cole is largely silent for the most part.
Well, Manny Cole is in a coma. These are Manny Cole's written words. Manny Cole, when he's speaking in the first 2 books, Tumbleweeds and the Vincetti Brothers, we could envision Manny Cole here. You have to remember, this is Manny Cole's manuscript. So we're not going to, this is what Manny Cole is writing. In the other books, Manny Cole is claiming to be the writer, but he's being written about. In this one, the conceit is that Manny has written this book, even though he really hasn't.